Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I mean, so often when people are involved in suffering, the real driving, biting question is, why is this happening? Why is this happening to a good person like me? You know, what did I do wrong? It's an attempt to get at all of the why questions, and that takes all of one's energy and strength. It seems to me to be a really valuable thing to shift that question to how. How can I cope? How can I marshal my resources so I'm able to be there when I need to be? You know, how can I carry my cross in Christian terms?
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Ernie Sibley, who is a local businessman and an instructor at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik and Mr. Sibley will be discussing coping with suffering. Now, here's Father Bacik.
Ernie, I'm glad to have a chance to talk with you. I consider you to be one of the fine dialoguers in the whole city of Toledo. You and I have had a lot of serious conversations. We've also had our other moments of trivial pursuits, and especially in sports. I feel like I should have a trivia question on sports to ask you, but I don't have one. Who was the last switch hitter to win the Most Valuable Player award?
And of course, most people say Mickey Mantle, and that would have been my first instinct. But those of you out in the radio audience, the answer was Vida Blue.
Terrific, Ernie, terrific. You know, I'm introducing this program with a bit of humor, and I'm not even sure why I'm doing that, except it's sort of customary, I guess. But we're dealing with a heavy topic, that of human suffering. I guess maybe it's good to keep a little bit of humor in mind with that. I remember when my father died, and my mother and my sister and myself, we were at the funeral home, and we were picking out a casket, and they wanted to sell us one that cost way more than it ought to, I suppose. And we were saying what my dad would have said to them at that point, and we ended up laughing rather hysterically over this. And the humor came in the midst of suffering. So maybe it's not. Maybe it's a very healthy thing in a way to combine a bit of humor with a heavy conversation on this topic of suffering. Do you have a theory of humor along that line? As you have a theory about everything.
I'm sure many of us have asked the question, why do things keep going this way? And then the next question is, what can I do about it? And my answer to that question usually is, I can either laugh or I can cry. And of the two, my choice often is to laugh, because the whole thing seems so painful, so uncontrollable, that if I cry, I might just disappear into a puddle of wet. Whereas if I laugh, there's something salvaged out of that. It becomes ridiculous at a certain point, and one needs to laugh about it.
You know what I think laughter does for us in a way is give us perspective. It reminds us that there's something at work in the midst of suffering that's bigger than we are, and that we are not controlling the whole business, and that we're in the hands of some larger power. And that I think it does help us to achieve perspective. I've noticed that in people who are suffering a lot of emotional, mental kinds of problems, that their laughter will change as they start to improve. That it becomes deeper and richer, and I think it's because the attitude has changed, because the outlook is now different, and one does not take perhaps oneself with utter seriousness at this point, or one's own problems and sufferings. Again, I don't want to talk glibly about that, because someone could listen to a conversation like that and say, yes, but I'm in the midst of horrible pain. Pain concentrates the mind. When I'm in the dentist chair, it's hard for me to keep my mind off of what's going on there. I mean, I try to use self-hypnosis and try to put myself in another place and so on, and it's hard for me to control my mind at that point. And I think very often when people, that's minor, of course, and when people are suffering real pain, it's hard to move out of that and to get this lighter attitude or this greater perspective.
Agree, though I've heard people talk about pain and a strategy they use in terms of allowing themselves to totally become immersed in their pain. And by doing that, instead of having the pain within them, inside of them, eating at them, when they're immersed in the pain is outside and external to them, and the image appeals to me.
Have you ever done that or tried it?
I have tried it in a couple of situations where I was feeling fairly secure that I wouldn't become swallowed up by the pain, and it seemed to work quite well.
Again, I don't know if I got that. You're supposed to identify closely with the pain and
totally immerse myself in the experience of the pain.
Yeah,
Totally confront it, cry, sob, weep, feel.
You're talking more emotional suffering?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I guess I had in my mind physical suffering, and I was trying to figure out how that was going to help.
It's possible to do that with physical suffering also, in terms of at some point it might become euphoric with physical suffering to move past it. The yoga idea of allowing things to move through you and not acknowledge them, rather than trying to block them, allow them to move through one side of you and go out the other. I've heard that expressed in some of the Eastern traditions. The dentist chair is rather a difficult situation, though. I don't know how to cope with that.
Yeah. You know, another thing that the way that would come to me is the very question of whether we can cope or not. I think that a lot of us who are feeling fairly well now and so on, you know, have to realize that as we go through life, we don't escape the cross of suffering. Our turn comes sooner or later. And that is, of course, a frightening kind of thought. I was talking to a woman lately who just told me she lives every day in panic over that. She's fine. There's nothing wrong with her. And she says she just worries constantly about that very point. I must say, I think I understand what she is saying. I mean, it comes to me in terms of, will I be able to cope when my turn comes, when the cross gets heavier? And that in itself, I think, is a painful kind of business. It does raise the whole question of how I could prepare myself for it, or how am I going to try to manage it when the time comes. I think we need strategies, techniques, whatever it is that we can muster.
Yes, perspective, particularly in terms of identifying and relating to other situations what is really painful, what I'm feeling, what I'm willing to feel, and how to cope with that, rather than to just sort of slide through. I know many people have such fine denial and coping mechanisms that they can go through a great deal of suffering without even recognizing they're doing it. And somehow it acts on their body, ulcers, stomach, asthma, and they're not aware of what's happening.
I was talking to a person recently who has a long history of dealing with very difficult emotional problems, and just recently has achieved the ability to face them head on and directly, and causes tremendous pain at the time, but he experiences it as being very liberating. In other words, he's learning a whole new way of dealing with it, and in facing it, which is so terrifying to him, he has found that he gets renewed energy and finds some healing for himself, and so on. It releases his unconscious in a way. And I believe that is really a tremendous strategy and a very important coping device in trying to deal with emotional, psychic kind of suffering. You know, as we're talking, Ernie, somehow it seems important to me to make that distinction maybe between physical suffering and emotional suffering. I mean, I know they go together, and sometimes if you are feeling emotionally down, I mean, you may well get a cold, or you have stomach cramps or something, and so they do definitely dovetail. And yet, I wonder if there aren't different coping mechanisms or strategies that we should keep in mind.
That's an interesting thought, though. I'm sure that you and I tend to use meditation or some sort of self-hypnosis for either physical pain or emotional pain, or both. Psychoanalysts talk about the ability to distract oneself from pain. I think they have a particular term for it, which I can't remember now. But I'm fascinated by the variety of coping mechanisms that people develop and that people use, coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms. And some of the mechanisms, strategies, can be eventually rather costly, I think, to the individual. Some of them are very effective. Some of them are effective but costly in the long run.
Let me tell you one that I think is absolutely crucial to the whole process, and that is shifting the question from why to how. I mean, so often when people are involved in suffering, the real driving, biting question is, why is this happening? Why is this happening to a good person like me? You know, what did I do wrong? It's an attempt to get at all of the why questions, and that takes all of one's energy and strength. It seems to me to be a really valuable thing to shift that question to how. How can I cope? How can I marshal my resources so I'm able to be there when I need to be? You know, how can I carry my cross in Christian terms? And I believe that really changes it around. It then directs our energy in a far more constructive direction, because ultimately there doesn't seem to be any great answer to the question of why. Therefore, it's a fruitless kind of endeavor, and we are better off trying to wrestle with this question of how. And then I think once that's the case, we are able to find different mechanisms that may well work. In other words, there's a collected wisdom that is available to us and that we find may help us out. But that first step, from why to how, is essential. And I think a lot of people, once they've made that turn, end up finding their own coping mechanisms.
Yes.
As you suggested, I mean, there's hundreds of ways of going about this, and once you start focusing on that, asking that question, we're more likely to find them.
Yes, as we've discussed, I think it's the responsibility of a would-be helping person not to respond to the question of why, but to divert that question to the hows. That the why question is often a manifestation of some underlying nonverbal pain or suffering that needs to be addressed more directly and coped with, and that just a sheer response to the why question solves nothing. One is still left with the pain and with no strategy with which to deal with that.
Now, one strategy you have suggested already here is, especially in dealing with psychic, emotional pain, and that is to directly face it, to get in touch with it, to feel it, to make it your own, to enter into it fully, and thereby try to transform it or transcend it or rise above it. You know, sometimes I think it's in Buddhist thought, they talk about dharma analysis, an attempt to unpack the cravings that are going on, to unpack the whatever emotional set that one has, and by cutting it apart, analyzing it, and so on, perhaps one undercuts its power to take us over. So that's, I think, maybe out of the Eastern traditions is another way of saying what we've learned in Western psychology about being in touch with our feelings, facing the demonic tendencies within us, bringing the shadow side into the light, all different ways, I think, of saying fundamentally the same thing, that escapism just doesn't work, that when you get away from the demons, they come back and get you at some other time or some other situation. So that if we're trying to list these coping mechanisms now, it seems for psychic pain, clearly one is face it, enter into it, and try to unpack it and overcome it.
Yes, my daughter was kind enough to put a note in front of me reminding me of
You mean your daughter who you brought along on this program?
Yes.
To prompt you in case you didn't know what you were going to say. Your daughter Mary, I believe,
Yes.
the one who's going in the Peace Corps,
going
to Honduras
for 27 months.
And that we are all going to be praying for in the next
and suffering in her absence.
Yes, right.
Yes.
Anyway, this daughter has placed in front of you a note which says
that crying is healing, and that reminded me of the great value of crying, and as a fairly traditional American male, some of the resistances I have to crying, but when I allow myself to do that, the tremendous healing value of tears.
Ernie, no one's going to buy that. All of us males know that crying is a sign of weakness. We're not going to buy this.
Well, yes. But there is tremendous value in that. Probably the best help I've ever given someone is when I was able to cry with them. And there's no more authentic sharing of one's pain than to share tears with them. And how many times, I'm sure myself, I've seen others say, there, don't cry. Because if you cry, that will make me feel your pain. Maybe I'll want to cry, and that's not okay. A helper should not cry. As you know, I've spent a number of weeks in the past several years with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in workshops. The workshops, 5 days, maybe 60, 65 people who spend the 5 days sharing their painful experiences, death of a child, cancer, a whole variety, spectrum, kaleidoscope of grief and suffering. And one thing Elizabeth won't let the participants do is touch the person while they're telling their story or while they're crying. And the reason seems to be, and I know this works from my own experience, if you're crying and I touch you, that can stop you from crying. But if I cry with you, that can help you cry more fully. But if I somehow stop you from crying, and touch is one way of doing that, then you aren't able to fully heal, experience your pain, cry it out, and get it finished.
That's really interesting. Ernie, tell me other things about that workshop you've done with Elizabeth Ross. Are there other things that you have learned out of that or that relate to this whole question of suffering?
Well, it's inevitably an incredible experience. Every time I go, I recognize how very sheltered I am, and certainly I've worked with a lot of people who have died and suffered my own deaths and griefs. But when I spend a week with 60, 65 people and hear some of the litanies of human pain and suffering, I remember one lady who stood up and said, "I have a short, brief story to tell you." And she said she was a nursing supervisor in her early 50s and a supervisor of an oncology ward. But then she wanted to talk about her husband. Her husband in 1 year had tried to commit suicide 31 times. And he wasn't judged sufficiently ill to be institutionalized. Now, she and her husband had 2 teenage kids. And the kids would get used to coming home from school and going out to the garage and cutting Daddy down from the rafters or turning the car ignition off. And the husband kept trying to kill himself, finally went out and committed armed robbery, hoping he would get shot during the incidents of the armed robbery. He didn't, but he did get put in jail for 2 years. While he was in jail, their oldest son died of cancer. He got out of jail and died of cancer about a year after that. Now, she said, "I'm not telling you this story in order to externalize my pain or to tell you how tough it's been for me. Of course it's been tough for me. It's been tough for all of you. I just want to point out to all of you that people do survive." And for me, the message, the feeling of that, the nobility of the human spirit, if that doesn't sound too yucky, I'm just continually overwhelmed by that ability of people to survive. I think one of the hows that's important when somebody is feeling pain is to help them remember that they have survived other pains, and that perhaps this is time-limited, and that this also shall pass, and that they are a survivor, and sometimes it's more painful to survive than other times, but nevertheless, you are a survivor.
I think that what you suggest is the whole importance, what I would call community of being with. I mean, you're sharing a group experience that way, and a lot of people maybe have similar experiences just being with the members of their family, and as they would articulate their pains and sufferings, or being part of a parish that's very supportive and so on. All of that seems crucial to dealing with suffering. It somehow seems really neat when you're hurting that someone puts their hand on your forehead maybe, or holds your hand, or gives you a hug, or allows you to cry in their presence. That seems liberating to us. That seems somehow helpful. If someone just says, "I'll be with you through this." I can remember incidents in my own life that way, and when people have just said something similar and maybe just been in the same room, and you know they're empathetic, and that's given me a resource, an energy that's been surprising to me. And I believe that, in other words, that presence, support, community are crucial things in dealing with suffering. We suffer alone. I mean, you feel your pain. I don't. I can't know exactly what it's like. You grieve alone. All of that is true, and yet we feel the need for being surrounded by warmth and comfort and caring people. And somehow I think that it's important. As I think of the Mother Teresa and the kind of work she does, and a lot of times that's just it. It's a ministry of presence. They know they're going to die. They're not trying to do any big medical thing with them or anything. They just don't want them to die alone out there on the street. They bring them in and they're present to them. And I think that means so much to human beings. And I guess the other thing I want to comment is this triumph of the human spirit, which I find too. I think all of us who do counseling or are close to people who suffer and so on, which is one of the, I suppose, gifts or blessings of the kind of work that I do and the kind of work that you seem to find yourself in so much, is to know that. To know that from the inside, to know the depth of the struggle, to know the extent of the suffering, and yet to see people somehow rising above it, coping anyway, carrying on. That is a great hope giver. I know myself, I can feel that about the question of depression. Just to know that some people have managed to deal with depression is very comforting kind of thought. Because when one is depressed oneself, you have this sense like, well, maybe I can manage it also. Ernie, you said something else I'd like to take you back to about you used meditation as a way of coping. And I would broaden that out to say prayer in general. It seems to me that that's a vital means for many people of coping with their sufferings. They talk about it in terms of asking God for help, but maybe more fundamentally praying for the grace of acceptance, that they are able to accept what is real, and that they are able to cope with reality. I mean, that's something in our Christian tradition that we get out of this whole story of Jesus. Jesus says, I've got to go to Jerusalem. His disciples say, no, you can't do that. That's trouble down there, And Peter's trying to stop him, and Jesus says, get behind me, you Satan. We've got to face reality. We've got to go to Jerusalem. That's where the action is. That's where the prophets go. That's what I'm called upon to do. That's the will of the Father, and we're going to do it. There's a gutty kind of gritty realism about all of that, and I think that stands as a model for us of what is needed. Our prayer says, help me to accept reality, help me to be like the Lord, be in tune with the Lord in dealing with life as it really is. And then I think that the prayer for the asking for healing, asking for cures, asking for help to deal with psychic problems makes all the sense in the world to me. Very often what it is doing, I think, is uncovering our own weakness, our own need. It's teaching us to surrender. Very often it's pulling us into union, I think, with other people who are suffering. And most of all, we're remembering our dependence upon the great God. So, I mean, in many ways, I think really prayer is an important thing here in trying to face suffering.
Also, I think it's probably important to point out the varieties of prayer, varieties of methods of prayer. My daughter, who is here with us now, bless her heart, has reminded me often of the possibility of praying with a sunrise or a sunset, the emotional communion with the gracious mystery available through that, and the healing power of that sort of experience, that sort of prayer. That is another reality that's present to us, that reality. If I can see that reality along with the reality of my suffering, then that's an absolving sort of prayer, healing sort of a prayer.
Indeed, yes. And I think it's that prayer, what prayer does for us, I think, is attune us to the presence of God that's always and everywhere available to us. I mean, I think that we shouldn't think of prayer as calling upon this deity up here who is testing us with suffering to take away the test, or to come and intervene on our behalf. I think the model of prayer I would like to see is that the helping God is always here. God's Spirit is always available to us. There's always strength here. All we have to do is open our mind and heart to it. What blocks it is the hardness of our own heart, and what prayer does is soften the heart. Set up some gaps, in a sense, so God's Spirit can work its way into the center of our being. It moves from our false self, where we want to be proud and independent, and sort of the remark I made facetiously before about men not crying, where we want to have that kind of macho thing, the false self, moves us away from that to the true self where God can really work with us. And I think in this case, a lot of talk about healing of suffering these days. And I think that is a very understandable thing. I mean, healings occur because people open themselves in faith to the power of God. They don't always occur, and God doesn't break, I don't think, the laws of nature to heal us, but there are ways in which our psyche flows open, and the power of the Spirit is really able to help us. And so, again, I would see prayer as having this healing kind of element in helping us to deal with suffering.
Absolutely.
Ernie, any other quick ways you want to get in, coping mechanisms that people end up doing? Silent presence. A lot of times I think it's just to be with people.
Oh, yes.
To hold them.
Undoubtedly the most difficult, particularly for those of us who tend to be more verbal. Mm-hmm. It's much easier to come out with quick, facile answers or advice than it is to be simply with a person. That's the most difficult thing to do. That's rather risky. And sometimes I'm able to do it, and often I'm not able to do it, and feel badly about it when I'm not able to.
Sometimes scary, right?
Yes. I'd rather not share your pain with you. I'd rather give you some facile, easy advice and walk away.
Right. Ernie, we're talking about the whole question of suffering and really how we cope with it. And I think that what we have seen is that there are not any great answers to the questions of why to human suffering. We don't find it in the great world's religious traditions. But we do find certain wisdoms around, certain experiences that people have garnered over the years and codified for us and that help us to deal with suffering. And so one clearly is to concentrate on the how I can cope and release my own creative energy. As you have suggested, to look at the past, at how I've coped before, bring that out, and maybe I can use that mechanism again. And then to try to use prayer, not use maybe a bad word, but to be involved in prayer so that we're open to the mystery around us. And then just presence to one another, sometimes silently, and just holding another so that the suffering seems more manageable.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Ernie Sibley, a local businessman and an instructor at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was coping with suffering. Comments or questions on the show or suggestions for future topics should be sent to Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Campaign of the Diocese of Toledo,